Thanks for coming to the workshop and also staying tuned now. So today I will talk to you about my project with Melanie Xue on the Proverbs in British industrialization. Okay. So it was in economic history, but I believe beyond economic history as well. Industrial revolution has been a very important topic. It is onset of the modern economic growth. I don't think we need to spend too much time in explaining its ultimate importance in economics literature. I list a couple of works; those are very famous people. And also the work by Proverbs and Jane Humphreys, which actually more speaks to the social side of this industrial revolution, which we will put our work on basically. Right, so this is the event, but in case you were not very well versed in this literature, right? So basically somewhere around 1750, you see industrial revolution taking place in the UK. And ever since then, it has triggered the industrial revolution also elsewhere around the world. There has been astronomical growth since then. Today we will focus on this literature on industrial revolution and the culture change. Right? So within this literature, it's mostly two types of hypotheses posed. One is the culture change has preceded the industrial revolution, right, which suggests, since like the 1500, there's already culture change in the societies. Right? So McCloskey has proposed that there is important culture changes, especially in the forms of socializing values, going on with the society since 1500, 1600, and 1700. Jerome Morpheus similarly proposed the important change, especially among intellectual elites in their attitudes towards knowledge production. So today we're going to be able to test all of this hypothesis to some extent, and then we're going to try to show you that a lot of those actually do turn out to be true. And second set of the hypothesis that focuses on a very different side of this issue. Right? It shows that culture change is more likely to have endogenously rise after the industrialization. This is Matthias's work on industrial revolution and endogenous preference formation. And they show that industrialization has changed the economic incentives, which leads to families to adapt childbearing norms that fostered patient effort in the work discipline. And historians and economic historians have also, social historians have also made some more comments. David Landis famously showed that in innovation and progress, those are attitudes and values might have only emerged after the industrialization. Same thing with Thompson, a social historian, in a similar point about time disciplines and work ethics. Right? The idea is that industrialization has forced everyone to become more diligent, to actually work, and they had to commit. And if they were late, then behind the assembly line, then nothing gets done. So it has also been making those points. And very different from the views we have seen here. So there is actually this view also about maybe nothing really changed. There has been a tremendous amount of persistence and the resilience of the underlying culture. The elites were extremely good at perpetuating their values. And there is also the larger literature. I think at this point of this workshop, we don't have to repeat, but there are a lot of people showing that culture matters in biological economic growth. Personality traits as well, closely related, and then also the ways we have been measuring culture. So my own work here, and then hopefully we can also say something about growth and productivity and the spatial disparities in productivity. Right. All right. So when we get to the Proverbs, because it's the main area we've been working a lot on in the past 2 or 3 years, and trying to figure out. First, if Proverbs is a good way for us to understand culture, and then if so, then what is the best way to understand the Proverbs in the context of those textbooks, not textbooks, the books, and also the newspapers? It's a way to track culture change. So there's 2 steps. So what are the Proverbs? So immediately you have this question, how the Proverbs are different from like memes or sayings, religious quotes. We do want to be clear here that we are thinking about Proverbs as mostly secular sayings. It's not religious or Bible quotes, even though we cannot completely rule those out. But it's mostly going to be secular. Right? It conveys those folk wisdom. So everyday life, people say something about what's true and what's not true, what it should be. Those will be considered as Proverbs. So luckily, right, in the past, it has been a long effort in compiling those Proverbs by experts. So for our purpose, this makes it helps a lot because they can actually looking at compilations of proverbs has been made by the experts dating back to the 1600s, not early. And we take those proverbs and then we look for them in the newspapers and the books. I'll show you how we do this. And then we then we track how much they show up and how often they show up and what are the topics of those topics. What we'll be working. So you might be wondering how we deal with a lot of changes or variants in the proverbs. So again, quite luckily, one of the features of the proverbs is they are relatively stable. They have actually maintained a similar form over time with relatively small variations. And their meaning has also been comparable over time period and across regions. So those are one of the few reasons why we have preferred the proverbs to many of the alternatives or other bits of the oral traditions, including tales, for this project. Right. So how is proverbs related to culture? Right. So this is in linguistics. People have studied this for quite a long time. We have thought about this in various ways as well. I think two features that it's worth highlighting. One is proverbs historically were much more widely used. So you might think proverbs today is only a few of those are still used. Historically, a much wider range of proverbs were used and by a lot more people. So intellectuals, so you're thinking about ordinary people. Adam Smith, wrote in his book, Wealth of Nation, actually was full of proverbs. Right? So just to give you an example. And it also has very broad and thematic coverage. If you look at proverbs, what's in it? It covers such a wide range of topics. So it also actually gives us some confidence that it could just be served as a system of values that pretty much covers everything you can think about in terms of cultural values. So we kind of do think of this as an effective tool to capture the entire space of cultural values, at least for the historical periods we are. Yeah, go ahead.
How much part of society that actually use this book? Very actually as a part of like something just happening on the or just
yeah, so the proverbs were very widely used, but we can only look at them if they show up in the newspapers and books. So there is this limitation.
Maybe related to that, I mean, if someone says a proverb today, it's usually tongue in cheek, right? So, I mean, we want to sort of make a point in a slightly old-fashioned and funny way. And if someone, and I also think in literature, someone shows up and uses a proverb, it's usually kind of cheesy and old-fashioned. So how do you understand the context in which, I guess, maybe 200 years ago in certain social groups, people could have said that in earnest, but probably in other social groups, if someone had brought up that proverb, that would have already been with some kind of irony. And today it would be clearly tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
So how do you distinguish the context?
So basically, I mean, I completely understand your point. So one of the reasons we had to stop our uses at around 1900 is because after that, indeed, a lot of the usage of proverbs, first, they're much less common. So you can just see this when we take the measure of proverbs, divided by total number of words in the newspaper, you can see it's clear decline after that. And then also, yeah, they might just not mean the same thing or in the same way that the previous people were using. So yeah, so in the
I think in Jane Austen, the people who use proverbs are usually people who are a bit of backward bigots and so on. So it's not like it ends in 1900, right?
Yeah, we do some of these checks. So with newspapers, it actually is more than 80% of those cases is exactly what they should be. So this does give us some confidence. Yes, I think you're right. Like, especially the more memorable usage is probably the ones that are not used as its intended uses.
Yeah.
But if we look at most of the uses, so yeah, that's what they mean. So the reason I'm more or less, so part of the reason we have become interested in study this is because the proverbs are actually still very widely used and in, to convey the meaning that it has in many parts of the world, even today. It's just in the West, it's true. At some point, you started to have some change of the usage and also attitudes towards proverbs because it's kind of seen as it's like lowly or in the peripheral, like hasn't. Yeah, but anyways, so historically they were much more widely used. So I think that it is worth mentioning that. Yeah. All right. So this is what we do. Right. So I've been saying the process will be, it's going through, so this is taking us a lot of time to try to just compile the proverbs from the existing compilations, dictionaries for the most part. And then we can also track them, right? So that's separately, separate process from how we interpret them. So we actually track them in history person of books in several different ways, and then aggregate them to the region level. So in this case, will mostly be common. Okay? And then I'm also going to explaining how exactly we encode this and also clusters and then do some classifications. I think there's a question there. Yeah.
So you said. Is like my view of which is Proverbs were very common. But I think they were used very seriously. The majority of all sorts of handbooks of I think it's really positive.
Yeah, but you will see the examples. So a lot of this, you have to convey experience and wisdoms, and a lot of this has nothing to do with religious doctrines. But obviously, it also be a source of those proverbs, like in many cases. So we don't raise this out. We actually have exact test about how many of those can be found in like religious texts and books as well. Okay. All right, so a couple of things we have to deal with. This the initial thought about this, obviously thinking about well, standard NLP approach, or you have some human coders, but both don't work perfectly because the standard NLP, after all, they focus on words, but then because of the proverbs, I think David also mentioned, they're not exactly the face value suggests, got 5 words. Find these 5 words show up in these proverbs doesn't mean that's what the proverbs. So therefore, the standard NLP approach doesn't really work. Human coders actually often don't understand the proverbs because they're so old and they're no longer in use today. So we don't really, we had to use some human coders for evaluations for sure, but in general, they often underperform the LLM when they are those very old antiquated proverbs. Okay? So we use the large language modeling, right? So we did have this fortune in this era able to do this. What we do is that we ask the GPT that, if you're a research assistant of the folktales, or oral traditions, and then can you explain this problem in a few sentences, plain English, right? Very simple stuff. Then interpret the proverb in terms of its implied beliefs, values, attitude, norms, and ideology. We do make it quite clear that it needs to be the culture and implications of those proverbs, not just anything that on top of the mind of the GPT. Okay, and then we get these answers. Like usually, a couple of sentences for each of those proverbs. That does help to bring out the meaning. Okay? So typically, you see those very concise forms, like out of danger. But then once the GPT reads it, it gives a much longer and detailed explanation. And then we have the Upwork annotators to help us to decide if those are good explanations or not. Right? And then in most cases, when we have 2 annotators from Upwork, and then you suggested that they like both almost equally, or they actually like the proverb, the GPT provided explanation slightly. So that's reassuring. And then we do some of the robustness, because even though we are relatively confident that we didn't change so much, at least not in a way that will affect our analysis, we do want to double check that this is not actually changing, right? So by asking the GPT again, then if the proverb means the same thing, right, in the 1600s and 1700s, 1800s or later. So we do that. And also check the other LLMs. Yeah.
You're talking about interpreting the proverb, but just identify what is a proverb, you just rely on this dictionary of existing.
Right. Yeah. So we rely on dictionaries. We don't have the picture here, but mostly the 4 of those old dictionaries. So it's dictionaries written in 1600 by one of the early fellows of Royal Society or something.
So if new proverbs come up with the Industrial Revolution, those would not.
Those will still be captured as well. So there is this also another dictionary we rely on in the 1880s. So I think that one does have some of those later ones, but most of the proverbs are very old. So you can tell just from the look of this, but yes, we do have some of those newer ones, and we don't distinguish between if it's just the more use of the old proverbs or it's the emergence of entirely new ones. We don't really do. So, and we do, and the next one we have to do, because if it's just single proverbs, it's very sparse, right? Thinking about 35,000 proverbs, how often can they show up? Probably it usually show up 5 times, with a few exceptions, but many of those are going to show up very rarely. So what we do is then we focus on, instead of individual proverbs, so we focus on the cluster of proverbs. Each of those will correspond with a topic. So some of the examples, clusters can be told. If we just look at a few of those representative proverbs and tell what they mean. Some of those very nicely mapped into categories we're interested in, right? Such as this time Russian, and seems to be falling into the time discipline category. Others not as much, but in general, it is a very clear meaning in most of those clusters. Right? So we like that. But we do want it to be more specific, because our hypothesis, as I showed you earlier, they're very clear about either time discipline or if it's about innovation. So we do something on top of that, right, by having those additional dimensions. They classify them based on wherever we're interested in, right? So then we have a different strategy here by having a different prompt when asking if the proverb is actually about, say, progress and improvement. This is just one of the sample examples we have. And then we tolerate like 5 different possibilities, including not applicable, right? So it either be yes, probably not, and definitely not. And
There's 22 minutes.
great. Right. So, and then what we do is then have to measure it actually in its, that's actually usage, right? So for this project, we're not happy with just knowing they exist. So we also want to know that how much they were used. In fact, that's what's going to drive our variation in our analysis. Okay. So we rely on 2 types of sources. So for books, we have the early English books online, like EDBO, and then also the 18th century collections online. Those are the 2 databases. They're full text databases, has been digitized. You cannot download it, but you can definitely search any interesting, in our case, proverbs in those databases. Okay. So we look for these proverbs in these 2 databases. This covers the period from 1550 to 1800, a little bit more than that, but mostly to the 1800. And then we also looking for the titles and authors and publication years of those usage, the books where we find the proverbs. And then we can, based on the location and the hometown of the authors, then attach proverbs to specific location. So what we do next, we do some of the analysis about how much it differs based on the education's aristocrat, whether they're aristocrat or not. In general, we don't find a huge difference, but there are some differences. We're still looking into this. So there are some differences in terms of how often or how much people use proverbs. So indeed, it depends. So it's not something that they use in the same frequency, different based on different social classes. There are some differences as well. So here I'm just showing you what it looks like in terms of distribution, right? So that's our data. So aristocracy and college status over time, right? In terms of the data composition, that's what we have. Haven't really done a whole lot about this, but this is something we have noticed and trying to do some of the descriptive analysis.
One of the things, to go back to my point before, it would be interesting to see in literature works, who are the characters using the proverbs or not. And that's indeed, is this the slightly dumb peasant or so, and how that changes over time.
I see. Yeah. So that's a good point.
It's completely different than that.
Yeah. So we haven't break down the sample about books yet, but we can totally do that because I think some of these are just in this.
And that will give you a
database.
sense of, within a certain, point in time and person, how are people perceiving Proverbs as to belonging to social groups?
I see, yeah, but that will require us to actually analyze every single instances,
Yeah.
which is still actually
No,
doable
it's
because
pretty
books.
different endeavors.
Yeah, but I get this point, like fiction, nonfiction, right, so different. Okay. Right, okay, so, all right, so then we'll do some, so let me actually go trying to find a way to go. Right, so then. Right, so next thing we do is we look for them in the newspapers. So the British newspaper database, they very widely used in many projects. So here we mostly looking for proverbs in the newspaper database, starting from 1700. There is a big caveat about this database. Data is very sparse. Before 1800, we mostly rely on books for this reason. But after 1800, we got quite a lot of coverage. Newspaper database. And then we look for proverbs in, and then if it's a newspaper published in a certain county, right, then we count this proverbs in that county. So this somewhat. That's a kind of a slightly different strategy we applied when we geocoded the proverbs. Right, this is an example of how proverb appeared historically, right? So if we look at the newspaper, then you see. This is one of those advertisements, right? So we, example of usage in historical usage. So many fogs in March and so many frosts in May. So it's kind of agricultural wisdom they're talking about. Something people have learned from many years of experience as a farmer. So they know that if you have a very cold March, a very foggy March, then you'll have a lot of frosts in May. So a lot of proverbs are conveying knowledge and wisdom in this particular fashion. Okay. Another example here is better live well than long. So, as I said, that's a lot of those it really is secular, right? It doesn't really have a religious background to this. Some of those are, but vast majority of those don't really have any religious connotations. Right. So then proverbs appear with very broadly similar intensity, right? So this is important because we do aggregate two different type of sources. We want to make sure that they are mostly comparable. If they're not, then we do the adjustments needed. Right? So then, therefore, I think the first thing I would like to show you is that the distribution of the topics of the clusters are roughly similar. Right? So here you see the proverbs from the books versus the proverbs from the newspapers on this chart for different topics in the clusters. So it looks like most of those are of similar height, right? It's not like they're hugely skewed for one source versus the other. Then if we just plot the coefficient, right, you also see that there is no big significant statistically significant differences between these two sources. So they're mostly comparable. Now that gives us some peace of mind, but right. However, we are not fully satisfied. We still wanted to know if there is differences such as in the frequency of using. So therefore, we checked all the usage in both sources and then see if there is a differences, we correct for them, right? Using this global correction factor. This could be improved, but this is what we have for now. Basically, we looked at all the proverbs in all the books and then how often they appear, right? And then also for newspapers, and then see there is a small difference in how often it appears. It appears slightly more in newspapers. And therefore, we wanted to adjust for this because when we aggregate this, we would not want it to just be in drive material. If we have more newspapers, then we mechanically have more proverbs, even though we do control for overall proverbs anyways, right? But we'd like to be a bit more sure by actually correcting for the sources.
And why don't you do the lambda topic specific, or do you do it as a robustness?
No, but because that's why I'm showing you the topics are mostly the same, so we don't really worry about this as much for this reason. Yeah, so we're mostly correcting for just overall topics. I could do this as well. Yeah, that's a good point. Because maybe for some time periods there is a divergence, right? In terms of... Okay. All right. So after doing all these corrections, this is what it looks like. In terms of overall proverb usage in different parts of the country. Like this is the registration district level. I think the point is that There are pockets of the country that uses Proverbs more, but in general, it's not like completely different for like the Northern England versus the Southern England. It's sort of random, like how much you use Proverbs. There are some places that for whatever reason do seem to have more interesting Proverbs, but nothing too peculiar and unusual stands out.
Scale or something, like how can you have 250 proverbs?
So it's many, yeah, so it's first, we now have actually words as well, but yeah, it's a scale. It has like a lot more in the numerator. So we multiplied it by, when it's actually here by like 1 million or something. That's all. Yeah. Okay, yeah. And this is being aggregated already. Yeah. So this is being. The books is by author's hometown, yeah. So where they're from. So therefore, we interpret this as if they use the proverbs, then that represents their values. So it will be tied this to the hometown. Yeah, it's very large share because Oxford Dictionary, Oxford Biographies actually has those informations, also their birth year as well. So yeah. Right. And then so we do some validation to show that it's meaningful measure of culture by showing it's correlated with name-based distance. So we also talked about today. Then we find a correlation there, like after conditioning for spatial distance, right? So physical distance, right? So they are still correlated, even conditioning the physical distance. All right, so now we've got everything ready, and then we start to think about how does that help us to address questions related to the industrial revolution and cultural change. So just briefly, like, before we get into this, so here we're mostly thinking about the industrial revolution for this time period, 1750 to 1850, and then a couple of features such as technological innovations, steam engines arrived, textile industries emerged. There's later then also iron and steel industries, and there's economic transformations. So the production used to be at home, then in this period it started moving to the factories, more cities, and there's also other accompanying changes as well, expansion of markets for them. Okay. And if we look at the key variables we're using in this paper, these are where they're distributed, like steam engines, varying numbers of steam engines around the country, and also the cotton textile. This is taken in 1838, so it's a bit later. You start to see more agglomerations, so more concentrated in just a few places. And then what we do is mostly two things. One is we test the hypothesis, which I showed earlier, including the work. And then we have also a more data-driven approach using all those clusters we've built. Okay. So I start with the first one, like what we do. Just to remind you, that's the hypothesis we had. And so one is about the how did we get here? So that's some areas. So one of this hypothesis we had is what's the bourgeoisie values, so the virtues. Right? So my philosophy, 2 of the first 3 books has made this point that bourgeoisie as a class used to be kind of a looked down upon and not trusted. Right? So sometime around just before the Industrial Revolution, right, we start to have a very different view of those people. Right? So first, then the society started to think that they can also be ethical. So market activities is not incompatible with being a good person. Okay? So their status were elevated and people start to respect them more. And then she argues that it was crucial. It was a prerequisite for industrial revolution. And then John Mokia, right? So that's the point, is a different point, emphasize the importance of the mindset for progress in the right? So I should have pointed out that Jared Rubin has a paper on this. It shows, from the analysis of the books, that there is an emergence of those ideas around this. Well, and then an early work by Joe has talked about practical knowledge. Right? So the idea is that it used to be the interest is just in theological knowledge, so like something much more abstract, and it was not thinking about how to make it, turn it into technology necessarily. Then again, around this time, then there is a switch in the mindset. People suddenly become more interested in practical knowledge. And then also this hypothesis related to how this culture change emerged after industrialization in terms of time discipline and also innovation.
You see this being like competing hypotheses? I kind of think like the first ones are about like elite attitudes and the bottom one is about like the population.
I see what you mean. Yeah, so there is that. I mean, I think they do have some of these important differences, including what you just mentioned. We also don't really think about them as competing hypotheses necessarily, because they are actually different culture traits. You can think of those both as culture, but they are very different culture traits.
Is it driven by the composition of the trinity of composition of the writers, or the same writers between their views? I mean the change in the values. It is driven by the composition of the writers from more elite class to more bourgeoisie class, or because the elite class they are changing their attitude towards the field.
Well, I mean, so that's why we do those checks, right? So we compare the different authors with different backgrounds, but also between books and newspapers. But there is not big differences in that. So if you compare the books and the newspapers, you might think there is a difference in who writes it, but they don't really have vastly different usage of Proverbs by topic. Right, so if we just plot our raw data, right, plot this proverb clusters over a random set of proverbs we have, and then you see those big differences, right? Big increase in those type of proverbs, right? Proverbs related to progress and improvement of practical knowledge, and maybe less clear for bourgeoisie values. So that's partly why we do want to have a more formal tested route, which we'll show you in the next slide. Okay. So here you see those mostly raw data. It's a relative intensity measure we constructed by taking by normalize the proverb usage in those topics by just random proverb you will find 1,000 of those random proverbs.
So how long does the data go? What's the end of the data set?
Which sorry.
How long does the data go for? So what's the end?
It's 1550. So if we go further
No,
back.
but to the present.
Oh, no, we end at, so the data, you can, in principle, you can go a little bit more, but yeah, the data with the newspaper data, you can go further, but I think that we had the question earlier, which I tried to answer. Is after 1900, there is a very big change in how people use proverbs. So they use it less often. I think it's a different type of people are using it. So we don't really do much after that. Yeah, we have that data though, but yeah.
So what does that substitute into? Like which proverbs are actually less used because are more used? Like, them?
That's a good question. We haven't looked at this, but yes, so there are many proverbs don't change, but we haven't looked at which went down necessarily in this part of the analysis. In the clusters, we did look at that. So for example, religious proverbs were much less used before the 1750, yeah.
Actually, a reflection of how over time production into writing or reading.
Yeah, so I think we had a chart earlier, I don't know if you remember, we have documented this composition of the writers based on their education background. We also documented how differently people use it based on their background. So we're still doing more work on that, but we're relatively assured, especially between the books and newspapers, because you don't see differences in the proverb topic use. So therefore, it shouldn't be a big deal.
How high is leadership?
The newspaper, I mean, it's still going to be a little bit of upper middle class. So until later. So we also have analysis about the tabloids versus broadsheets. You can also see some of the differences there. Yeah.
This one.
On the broads and the tabloids will use more proverbs. Sorry.
So I see the decline. That would be really explain the change. Newspaper.
Yeah.
Reduction in new press machines, leadership between taken out of the taken and the very strong shape of a lot of newspaper to institutionalize newspaper. So I think a lot of what might be
It's a good, yeah. As I said, we're still investigating this aspect, but right now, I wouldn't say too much about this, but at the moment, yeah, so there is change, especially in terms of the rise of the tablets. So that is very noticeable. Okay. All right, so then we do this following test. I have 5 minutes, right? Or 3 minutes, okay. All right, so what we do is we first to show that if we estimate the trend, right, what happens? So for this all 3 traits, we find that those are the controls we have. We worried about other things, right? We worry about other things were changing during this time. there will be like increasing, expansion of the markets, for example, some of those geographic traits. This is report or something could actually be predicting those changes, important changes in conditions before the industrial revolution. So we're trying to control for those as much as we can. And then we find that there is an increasing trend with visualizing virtuals. And no matter where you look at, in steam engines or the context of plants, and you also find a change in the progress in the improvement. This is Nokia's hypothesis, as well as with a practical knowledge. We find pretty strong evidence in line with all these three hypotheses for the culture change preceding 1750 places with this increasing trend and then later industrialized. Okay. And then this is with the clusters. As I mentioned, there is a decline in the religious and spiritual themes. That's the only thing we saw quite noticeable, like they went decline. A lot of those kind of stay the same. That's what we find for stellar clusters. In the remaining 1 minute, I'm showing you what will happen with those are alternative specifications. The same thing. In the remaining 1 minute, I'm showing you what are the effects of industrialization. Okay, so then this is more like a sort of like a BID, but it's mostly the effects of industrialization on those clusters or the topics. And then what we find, we do use the instrument here. We use the co-proximity following this having the Rook's work. And then we also show that this is mostly conditionally exogenous into pre-existing conditions. Look at the co-proximity. It's not really correlated with either pre-industrial markets or markets in earlier time or enclosure of population density in 1750. Okay, so we then use this instrument. I cannot answer the question. I have to finish. So then you have time discipline as the first candidate we passed. Also work ethics, I should say. And then you find a variance. Well, there is increasing in the topics of Proverbs that is related to time discipline or work ethics. Okay. We find quite strong support for this hypothesis as well. And then also for innovation. Basically, most of those hypothesis has appeared to be correct. We have find quite strong evidence for also the effects on culture traits in terms of time discipline and innovation. And then if we do this plots, where we find quite a noticeable jump right around the time of 1750 in places that industrialized. All right. With some other additional findings, like interestingly, they're quite different from what you might have believed. There is actually a decline in honesty and truth. That type of Proverbs upon industrialization. So it didn't seem to be very good for social fabric, at least not in the immediate term. Okay. All right, to conclude. Oh.
You may be less worried about it. And do you talk about honesty being important, or because you think so many liars that you have to kind of emphasize that
yes.
Honesty is actually a good idea.
Yeah. So we're still wondering about that, but maybe you're right. Yeah. So maybe it's just not as big a concern. So therefore people talk less about it. Could be both. So to conclude, we find a way to quantify those culture change across domains and over time, right? So we're arguing this is a very effective way to look at culture change, perhaps not just for industrial revolution, but also in other contexts. We show that the Proverbs are correlated with those culture domains, and the tracking their usage over time also provide useful information. In terms of the topics we are examining, we find that industrial revolution do seem to be predicted by those increasing trends in certain cultural values beforehand, but itself also generating important culture changes afterwards. So we find strong evidence actually in line with or different three or four, five hypotheses we test in these two aspects, both the culture change before and after the industrial revolution. That's what we. Time.